Hey guys, tonight we're heading to the ancient mountains of China. Imagine standing at the foot of towering peaks, the air cool and crisp, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive in the distance, the rustle of trees. Or is it something else? You might think that the mountains, majestic and calm, are just part of the natural landscape, but the ancient Chinese saw them as something far more mysterious. Mountains were believed to be home to terrifying creatures, beasts that didn't just stalk the earth, but roamed the skies and seas. Now, you probably won't survive this adventure, but don't worry. There's no need to pack a sword or shield. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the time. There, it's always nice to know where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Down mountains to the ancient Chinese were not just piles of rock. They were places where gods lived, the crossroads of the natural and supernatural worlds. There was something almost magical about these towering peaks. To them, these mountains were a bit like nature's haunted houses, isolated, towering, and home to creatures no one wanted to meet. They weren't just steep, imposing masses of stone and earth, but places that held secrets, dangers, and, in some cases, outright monsters. Now, you might wonder, what exactly did the ancient Chinese imagine these creatures to be? Well, it was pretty much everything that was feared and revered. Some mountains, particularly those deep in the mysterious wilds, were thought to harbor not just wild animals, but actual supernatural creatures that defied the laws of nature. From giant birds that could lift whole trees to serpentine beasts that slithered through the earth. Mountains were filled with stories that left you wondering whether you were ever truly safe. Some of these creatures came from the pages of the Shan Hai Jing, or the classic of mountains and seas. But even before this famous text, the ancient Chinese believed that mountains weren't just geographical features. They were spiritual hubs. People believed that mountains could influence their fate, like how certain mountains were seen as protecting the land from evil spirits, while others, like the infamous Kunlun Mountain, were home to the gods themselves. But what really made these stories stand out? And why did mountains have to be home to these creatures? Well, historians still argue whether the notion of mountains as homes for monsters was tied more to the natural dangers. Steep cliffs, dangerous wildlife, the eerie quiet of a place so remote. Or if it was more about shaping the landscape in a way that matched the human need for the mystical and unexplained. Just imagine the fear, then, of a place where you'd look up and see shadows among the peaks, or hear noises you couldn't quite place. Was it the wind or something else? You could probably bet that your mind would start imagining things that weren't quite there. But it wasn't just about terrifying creatures. Mountains were also considered places of immense power, places where the earthly and divine could meet. So, while some beasts roamed the crags and ravines, others, more divine, more peaceful, were said to reside there. Ancient Chinese people were, in essence, living in a world where danger was everywhere, and to survive, they needed to make sense of it somehow. Imagine standing there, right at the foot of a mountain, hearing that wind picking up, feeling the ancient energy pulsing through the ground. Whether or not you believed in these monsters would hardly matter. In the stillness, you might feel like something was lurking just out of sight, and it would be easy to believe. But don't worry too much. As ancient as these stories are, they seem more like a lullaby now, don't they? A gentle story about creatures that might have never existed, but were comforting in their own way, like distant dreams. Maybe we can find comfort in these strange legends. 2. As the moonlight filters softly through the trees, we continue our journey into the mysterious landscapes where ancient Chinese people believed mountains weren't just natural formations. They were places of raw power. These colossal peaks stood guard over the land, casting long shadows that hid more than just rocks and trees. The belief was that these mountains were homes to some of the most mysterious and fearsome creatures you could imagine. But why mountains? Why not, say, vast plains or dense forests? Well, when you think about it, mountains are, by their nature, isolated. They're not just tall. They dominate the landscape, shaping the environment and the people around them. And ancient civilizations, like the Chinese, often saw things in a very spiritual way. These high places weren't just home to monsters. They were thought to bridge the gap between earth and the heavens. The taller the mountain, the closer it was to the divine. Historians still debate whether mountains were considered home to these supernatural creatures because of their isolation, or whether it was because they were seen as so immense and powerful that the humans who lived in their shadow needed something equally impressive to explain their majesty. It's almost as if these mountains were begging for the creation of myths, asking the storytellers to craft tales worthy of their towering presence. Let's take a moment to consider the creatures that were said to live there. Many of these creatures came straight from the Shan Hai Jing, the classic of mountains and seas, which is full of these bizarre beings, part man, part beast, part god. These weren't just your everyday dragons. No, some of them were strange hybrid animals, like the giant bird, whose wings were so large that they could block out the sun, casting shadows over the earth as if it were the middle of the night. Picture that. You're standing at the base of a mountain, trying to get your bearings, and suddenly a great shadow passes over you. The wind picks up, and the sound of wings fills your ears. Is it a bird, or is it something more terrifying? The ancient Chinese believed it was more than just a bird. It was a creature of the heavens, one that could bring either fortune or disaster. Then there's the creature called Xuanwu, often depicted as a tortoise with a snake wrapped around it. This beast was said to inhabit the mountains where the earth and sky meet, a symbol of endurance. The tortoise was associated with longevity and protection, but with that snake, it also carried an air of danger, a reminder that even in the most sacred and revered places, danger lurked just beneath the surface. Now, the interesting part is that these creatures weren't just part of scary stories told around a campfire. They were part of the daily fabric of life. Whether people believed in these creatures wholeheartedly or not, they were woven into the culture. These myths helped ancient Chinese people make sense of the world around them. The creatures were part of the landscape's unknowns, just like the unknown dangers of nature. They gave the mountains personality. They made them alive. Historians often point out that these myths might have been designed to explain natural phenomena. The Shanhai Jing, for example, describes mountains as places where the Earth's energy was concentrated, creating the perfect environment for these strange creatures. Some of them were thought to guard the borders of the known world, marking where the safe, civilized lands ended and the wild, untamed territories began. These mythical beings weren't just things to fear, they were also things to respect. As you imagine this, think about the reality of it. You're a person living in an ancient society, and your world is filled with the vast unknown. You see mountains towering in the distance, and you might not know what's up there, but you know it's important. Maybe you've heard stories. Stories about the Xuanwu, or the giant bird, or the creatures that slithered out of the mist. The mountains hold power, and the creatures living there could help or harm. It's easy to forget just how much our ancestors lived in awe of nature. To us, mountains are often just scenic wonders or places to hike. But for the ancient Chinese, they were places where the supernatural was as real as the land beneath their feet. The idea of creatures lurking just beyond sight was a reminder that there was always something bigger, something older, something more dangerous than humanity could ever understand. Yet, despite the fear that these monsters might invoke, there was also something incredibly calming about these myths. They represented the balance between the known and the unknown, the calm and the chaos. When ancient Chinese people looked at the mountains, they saw not just physical obstacles, but metaphysical ones. They saw the boundaries between the world they knew and the world of mystery. You might be wondering how these ancient beliefs have managed to survive in the modern world. After all, we are far from the days of living in fear of giant, winged birds. But the thing is, these stories aren't just old myths. They're pieces of a culture that still resonate in the modern world. So many of our fears, dreams, and stories are shaped by the natural world, just as the ancient Chinese once believed. As we journey deeper into the history of these mountains, and the creatures that inhabit them. Keep in mind that these weren't just stories. They were ways for ancient people to explain the vastness of the world around them. And maybe, just maybe, there's something calming in that idea. The mountains, the creatures, the gods, they all represent something we still search for today. Understanding the boundaries of the world and the mysteries that lie just beyond them. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine those great peaks, their shadows stretching out over you, the air cool and full of stories. What creatures might be waiting in those quiet, mysterious heights? Or maybe, as you drift off, you'll find a peaceful rest in knowing that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The night deepens, and as the shadows stretch longer, we continue our exploration into the ancient Chinese belief that mountains were more than just geographical landmarks. They were spiritual gateways. Picture yourself once more standing at the foot of these towering peaks, where the air is thin and everything feels larger than life. The mountains feel alive, as if they are watching you, knowing more than you could ever understand. But it wasn't just the towering height of these mountains that inspired awe. It was the creatures that were said to dwell within them. Now, before you start picturing giant beasts stomping around in the mist, let's take a moment to dive into the Shan Hai Jing, that fascinating compilation of mythical creatures and geographical descriptions that served as the ancient Chinese's guide to the world beyond the known. You see, the Shan Hai Jing isn't just a text of folklore. It's more like an ancient encyclopedia that connects the geography of the world with the creatures said to inhabit it. Among the many creatures described, one stands out for its terrifying, yet oddly peaceful nature, the Jiangshi, or hopping vampire. While it didn't originate from the mountains, its connection to the supernatural landscape of China can't be ignored. Imagine it, a stiff, reanimated corpse that can only hop due to the stiffness of its limbs. Yet this creature could drain the life force from the living. In a way, it was the Jiangshi that represented the imbalance of the world, the dead mixing with the living in the land of the living. It wasn't a mountain creature in the traditional sense, but this eerie legend spoke to the dangers of venturing too far into the unknown, into places where the forces of nature and the spiritual realm intertwined. So, what did this tell people? Maybe it was a way of explaining those nighttime sounds in the mountains, the eerie rustling of trees, the feeling of being watched, the deep growls in the distance. Historians still argue whether these creatures were really meant to scare or simply to caution ancient travelers. After all, who would venture into an unknown mountain pass or forest without a bit of fear? Perhaps these creatures were just a part of the psyche of people who needed to respect these wild places. When you look at a mountain, you see something majestic and terrifying. At the same time, a symbol of all that is unknown. And yet, people still found ways to tame their fears with stories of monsters. But these creatures were not all about horror. Some were tied to the belief that mountains were sacred places where gods and immortals lived. The ancient Chinese believed that the gods of the mountains could provide protection, and that the more you respected the mountains, the more likely you were to receive their blessings. In some regions, people believed that offering sacrifices to mountain gods could help bring fertility to the land or ensure a bountiful harvest. There was something almost serene about the way these gods were depicted. There wasn't the panic or dread associated with the beasts that lurked in the shadows, but rather a calm reverence. One of these gods was Zhu Rong, the god of fire, who was believed to reside in the mountains, and whose presence was said to influence the land's ability to grow crops. But even in the stories of these divine figures, there was always an underlying sense of danger. The mountain gods were not to be trifled with. They were powerful beings who could bring about both creation and destruction. Just like the mountains themselves, they could inspire awe, fear, and respect all at once. But let's take a moment to imagine one of these ancient legends in action. You stand at the foot of a mountain, gazing up at the rocky peaks shrouded in mist. You've heard the stories, the ones about the gods who reside there, the creatures that call these mountains home, and the danger that awaits those who wander too far from the path. The wind picks up, the trees sway, and you hear something moving in the distance. Is it just the wind, or is it something more? As the night deepens, it's easy to imagine the kinds of stories people might have whispered around campfires, recounting these tales to explain the strange noises and the odd shadows that seemed to move on their own. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks on them, or maybe, just maybe, there was something more to the legends. With each passing night, the fear turned into respect. The mountains were no longer just dangerous. They were sacred places filled with gods, monsters, and mysteries that kept the ancient Chinese people humble. In some ways, these beliefs about mountains and creatures also served as a reminder to stay within your limits. The mountains were a world unto themselves, breathtaking, awe-inspiring, but also unforgiving. And perhaps that's the reason these stories have persisted for so long. They tap into that universal fear of the unknown, the things we can't control, but can only hope to understand. The idea that no matter how far we've come, there are still places in the world that remain just out of reach. Now, as the night wraps its cool, comforting embrace around you, imagine the mountains that loomed so large in the hearts and minds of the ancient Chinese people. The creatures, the gods, the legends, they all continue to exist in some form, tucked away in the pages of ancient texts, waiting for us to discover them once again. And just as these mountains once cast long shadows over the earth, they now rest quietly in the memories of those who dared to explore them. Let these stories settle in your mind as you relax. knowing that some mysteries are best left to the imagination. As the night deepens, we slip further into the serene but eerie world of ancient Chinese beliefs, where mountains weren't just physical landforms, they were the boundaries between the known and the unknown. Imagine the air growing colder as you venture further up a mountain trail, the thick fog rolling in like a blanket, swallowing the path behind you. The deeper into the mountain you go, the less you know. And that's exactly what ancient Chinese people believed. The further you travel, the more supernatural forces you might encounter. One of the most striking aspects of these beliefs was how mountains were viewed not only as physical places, but as spiritual ones. It was as though the mountains themselves were the portals to another world, a world filled with creatures that could easily blur the line between the living and the dead. The Shan Hai Jing, the classic of mountains and seas, describes mountains as having a tangible effect on the world, with gods, immortals, and legendary beings scattered throughout the peaks and valleys. The creatures from this sacred text weren't just figments of imagination. They represented the forces of nature, wild and untamable things that the ancient Chinese couldn't control, but needed to respect. Many of these creatures were seen as guardians or protectors of certain regions, marking boundaries between civilization and the wilderness. But others were far more dangerous, a reminder of what could happen if humans ventured too far beyond the familiar. The idea was that these creatures didn't just exist in the mountains. They were part of the very fabric of the landscape, woven into its mythology. One of the most fascinating creatures from the Shan Hai Jing is the Bai Zi, a beast that was said to inhabit the remote mountain regions. This creature was described as having the body of a lion, the tail of a snake, and the face of a human. Imagine encountering something like that. A hybrid of all things wild and unnatural. The Bai Zi was said to have the ability to speak, and according to legend, it shared its wisdom with the Yellow Emperor, teaching him about the ways of the world and how to protect his people. In many ways, the Bai Zi was a symbol of the untamed, but also of the potential for knowledge and growth in the unknown. It wasn't a simple monster. It was a bridge between the human and the supernatural. But not all the creatures were as wise or benevolent. Many were downright terrifying. The Shan Hai Jing talks about serpents that could crawl out from the earth, great winged beasts that could blot out the sun, and creatures with claws that could tear through stone. These were creatures of destruction, and they were said to guard the entrances to sacred spaces. Think about that for a moment. The mountains, which were already seen as boundary markers between the earth and the divine, also held creatures that could easily destroy anything that dared to cross into their realm. These guardians weren't just mythological people. Believed they kept away the unworthy, protecting both the land and the gods that resided there. Historians and scholars have long debated the true nature of these creatures. Were they simply a way for ancient Chinese people to explain natural phenomena like thunder or sudden storms, did the Bai Zai represent the power of nature, and the other beasts signify the dangers of venturing into unknown lands. Historians still argue whether these creatures were meant to symbolize anything more than just the human fear of the wilderness, or whether they were seen as real entities. In the worldview of ancient China, some believe that these stories were a way to teach people to respect the mountains. Others think they were just good stories, meant to entertain and warn. One thing is clear: the mountains were a world unto themselves. To the people of ancient China, they were sacred, mysterious, and dangerous. They were both a home for gods and monsters alike, and a place where the line between the living and the supernatural was never clearly drawn. The more we learn about these ancient beliefs, the more we see how deeply tied people's lives were to the natural world around them. The mountains weren't just things you hiked over or admired from afar. They were beings unto themselves, capable of both incredible beauty and terrifying danger. Picture yourself now at the base of one of these mountains, the wind whispering through the trees, the shadows stretching long as the sun sets. You can feel the weight of the myths hanging in the air, the knowledge that something ancient, something powerful might still be there. Maybe it's the wind rustling through the leaves, or maybe it's something else. The ancient Chinese didn't have the scientific tools to explain the strange sounds or eerie feelings they encountered, so they turned to myth. And in those myths, they found not just monsters, but stories that helped them understand their world. As you sit with this knowledge, remember that for the ancient Chinese, the mountains were more than just rock and soil. They were places where humans, gods, and monsters existed side by side, and where every shadow, every rustling leaf might have hidden a secret. The mountains were places where the known world and the unknown collided, creating a powerful, mysterious landscape that could never be fully understood. So as you relax, let the images of these creatures, both fearsome and wise, settle into your mind. Feel the cool mountain air, the whisper of ancient winds, and the strange calm that comes with knowing that there are mysteries in the world that don't need to be solved, just embraced. The air grows colder still as the night deepens and you settle in for the next leg of this journey. The mountains, with their towering peaks and endless mystery, loom larger in your mind. As we continue to wander through the wild landscapes of ancient China, we see how the mountains were not merely natural features. They were an integral part of the spiritual and physical landscape. People didn't just live with the mountains, they believed they were part of a larger cosmic dance, a place where the boundaries of the earthly realm met the supernatural. So, why did the mountains have such significance in ancient Chinese thought? It's simple, really. Mountains were symbols of stability and power, often thought of as the spine of the earth itself. They stood firm, untouched by the tumult of the world below. But even in this immovable stability, mountains were also seen as dynamic, mysterious, and teeming with life. Some of it dangerous, some of it divine, and that's where the creatures come in. These creatures, often gods, sometimes monsters, were not just mythological figures to be feared. They were integral to the Chinese understanding of how the world worked. For instance, consider the Kunlun Mountain, which was often described as the birthplace of the gods. In these mountains, it was said that immortals lived in peace, away from the chaos of the human world. It was the highest and most sacred mountain in ancient Chinese cosmology, and it was said to be the residence of the Queen Mother of the West, a goddess associated with immortality, who offered peaches of immortality to those who were fortunate enough to be in her presence. So, the mountains were not only homes to beasts, they were homes to divinity, to those who could shape fate. However, not all mountains were peaceful sanctuaries of gods. Some were seen as gateways to the underworld, or as realms of terrifying creatures, sentinels of boundaries no human should cross, and those creatures were terrifying indeed. The Shan Hai Jing is packed with strange beings, creatures whose very existence makes you feel a little uneasy. But unlike modern horror stories, where the monsters are usually things we'd never want to face, the creatures of these ancient stories were a bit more complicated. One of the most intriguing of these beasts is the Jieji, a one-horned, lion-like creature. This beast was often depicted as a symbol of justice, believed to have the ability to discern guilt and innocence. Imagine, if you will, that you stand at the foot of a mountain in the mist, and suddenly a creature like this appears in front of you. What would it do? Would it protect you, or would it turn you away? Based on its ancient sense of justice, these creatures, while fearsome, had a higher purpose. They were more than just figures of fear. They were agents of balance in a chaotic world. Historians still argue whether these creatures served purely symbolic functions, or whether the ancient Chinese believed them to be real. Some believe these legends were simply cautionary tales. The Zieju, with its incredible sense of justice, may have been a reflection of the moral code by which the Chinese sought to live. The ancient mountains, then, were not only places of danger, but places where the moral and natural orders intersected. They were sacred spaces where the forces of good and evil were in constant motion. Think about it. These legends were about finding balance in a world where the forces of nature were both powerful and unpredictable. The mountains were more than just physical boundaries. They were spiritual ones. When the ancient Chinese spoke of mountains and their monstrous inhabitants, they weren't just talking about physical dangers. They were speaking about the very forces that shaped their understanding of the world. And in doing so, they created a world where nothing was as simple as black and white. Instead, everything had its place in the greater cosmic balance. As the night stretches on, we can see how these ancient beliefs evolved over time. The terrifying creatures of the mountains didn't just stay there, hidden in the mist. They became symbols of justice, of the wildness of nature, and even of the unknown dangers lurking in every corner of the world. These ancient stories were meant to remind people that the world was vast and mysterious, that no one had all the answers, and that the creatures of the mountains were just as important as the gods who lived there. But in the end, these stories aren't meant to frighten us. They remind us that mystery and danger are always present, just outside the realm of the known. And while the ancient Chinese believed that these creatures were guardians, they also believed that each person could, in their own way, navigate the balance between the known world and the supernatural, just like the Oshtiaji, who weighed guilt and innocence. We too have to navigate the balance between light and dark, between the natural and the unknown. As you ease into sleep tonight, think of those ancient mountains, their peaks hidden in mist. Picture yourself standing at the foot of one of these sacred places, feeling the cool air against your skin. In the distance, you hear the sound of something moving a creature, perhaps, or the wind playing tricks on you. Whatever it is, it's part of the mystery, part of the landscape of the mind. Let it be a reminder that in the vast unknowns of our world, there's always something more to discover, and sometimes it's the mystery itself that keeps us grounded. As the night settles deeper, imagine that you're perched on the edge of an ancient Chinese mountain, gazing into the distance, where the shadow of an immense, looming figure moves between the peaks. The air is thick with the scent of pine and the faint echo of whispers. Are they the wind or something else? The mountains, in ancient Chinese belief, were not only home to monstrous beasts, but also to gods that could grant blessings or bring misfortune, depending on how the land and its people were treated. This was the great mystery that surrounded these places. Mountains were revered, feared, and respected all at once. In the ancient Chinese worldview, these sacred mountains were connected to the heavens, and the higher the mountain, the closer it was to the divine. This connection between the earthly and the celestial is what set these mountains apart from others. They weren't just obstacles or landmarks in the landscape. They were seen as points of access to the gods themselves. If you wanted to speak with the gods, it was said, you had to venture into the mountains, offer sacrifices, and navigate the forces of nature and the supernatural. But not everyone was worthy of this honor. Take, for instance, the Mount Tai, one of the 5 sacred mountains of China. It was thought to be the site where emperors went to perform their sacred rituals, paying homage to the heavens in the hope of securing divine favor. Ancient records describe how the emperor, with great ceremony, would climb the mountain to offer sacrifices to the Jade Emperor, the ruler of the heavens. This was a powerful spiritual act, a symbolic gesture of mankind's place within the cosmos and its relationship to the gods. The mountain, then, wasn't just a natural feature. It was an intermediary between the divine and the mortal realm. The mountains with their mystical aura, served as the home of deities, like the Shiwangmu, the Queen Mother of the West, who resided in the remote, fabled Kunlun Mountain. According to legend, she ruled over immortals and had the ability to bestow eternal life, while most people would never make the perilous journey to her abode. The very idea of her existence and her role in the cosmos spoke to the belief that these sacred mountains were places where gods could be reached and where the forces of nature and the divine intersected. But not all the deities associated with the mountains were benevolent. The legendary creatures of the Shan Hai Jing were also closely connected to the sacred geography of China. These creatures, like the Baize and the Xie we've discussed earlier, were seen as guardians or challenges to human beings who ventured too far. They were symbolic of the dangers of the unknown, reminders that the supernatural forces at play in the mountains were not to be trifled with. Historians continue to debate whether these gods and monsters were truly believed to inhabit the mountains, or whether they were simply symbolic representations of the forces of nature. Were the ancient Chinese simply explaining the dangers of the mountains and the mystery of the unknown, or did they truly believe in gods and monsters living within the peaks? Some argue that these legends served as warnings, keeping people from wandering too far from civilization. After all, with no modern roads or maps, the mountains were perilous, and the people needed explanations for the strange occurrences they might encounter. But beyond just the physical dangers of the mountains, there was also a deeply psychological component to these beliefs. The idea of supernatural guardians and the mystery of the creatures that lived there created a sense of awe and reverence, not just fear. The mountains were sacred, mysterious, and ancient, and to stand in the shadow of a peak that had been revered for centuries was to be connected to something much larger than oneself. Even in their silence, the mountains spoke to the people, drawing them in, urging them to climb, to seek, and to worship. As you lie back, imagine yourself standing before one of these towering peaks. The vast, silent expanse stretches before you, and there's a soft, ancient wisdom in the air around you. The mountain isn't just a physical feature. It's a living, breathing entity in its own right, full of history and mystery. Perhaps, like the ancient Chinese, you can feel the pulse of the earth beneath your feet, the whispers of the gods just out of reach. These are the moments that connect us to something greater, something beyond our comprehension, but still so deeply felt. And then the thought lingers. What if there are still mysteries like this waiting to be uncovered? What if the world around us still holds unexplored peaks, untold stories, and creatures that we haven't yet discovered? The ancient Chinese believed that the mountains were full of such wonders, both terrifying and divine. Their stories, whether fact or myth, were a way of explaining the wildness and uncertainty of the world. So as you relax into the stillness of the night, let the sense of mystery settle in. Let the idea that there is so much yet to be understood about the world around us, comfort you. The creatures, the gods, the forces of nature, they are all part of the same tapestry. And maybe, just maybe, we don't need to have all the answers to enjoy the beauty of the mystery. As the mountain winds blow softly in your mind's eye, let the stories of ancient guardians, gods, and creatures drift into the quiet corners of your dreams, where they can rest undisturbed until the next time we wake up, ready to explore once again. The night continues to settle around you, and as the silence deepens, the eerie quiet of the mountains stretches out into the distance. It's hard to fully grasp how deeply entwined the mountains were with the lives and beliefs of the ancient Chinese. To them, the mountains were sacred ground, places of reverence and power, where the boundary between the human and divine worlds was often blurred. These sacred mountains weren't just homes for gods and mythical creatures. They were where heaven and earth met, places of transformation, mystery, and danger. One of the most important things to remember about ancient Chinese beliefs is that they didn't just see the mountains as physical entities. They saw them as representations of cosmic order. In their worldview, the mountains were the spine of the earth, the foundation upon which the world rested. From these heights, everything below human civilization, nature, the animals, and the heavens came together in a delicate balance. The gods who lived in the mountains weren't detached from the world. They were deeply involved in shaping its fate, and through the mountains, they could influence the lives of those who lived beneath them. But this sacred connection came with its own dangers. In many ways, the mountains were a double-edged sword. They were places of refuge where people could connect with the divine, but they were also places of great peril. For the ancient Chinese, mountains were seen as the homes of the divine. Yes, but they also played host to chaotic forces that could destroy you. If you weren't careful, it was in the wildness of the mountains that these forces were said to take form, beasts, gods, and spirits that were both protective and destructive, depending on your actions. The relationship between people and mountains wasn't simply one of fear, but of respect. The mountains were thought to hold secrets, ancient, untold knowledge, and only the brave or the devout could access it. To climb the mountains was to test yourself against the unknown, to take a spiritual journey that was as much about what was within you as what was beyond you. And it wasn't always about what you could bring back. Sometimes it was about what the mountain took from you. Your fears, your doubts, your old self leaving you transformed in some way. For those who dared venture into these remote, mystical mountains, there was a possibility of encountering not just mythical beasts, but immortality. Some stories claim that the gods who lived in these sacred places could grant eternal life to those who sought it out. Imagine it now, a mountaintop temple bathed in sunlight, where the scent of incense lingers in the air, and the soft chants of monks fill the breeze. In these places, the boundary between life and death was often said to be thinner. The gods didn't just watch over the mountains. They were believed to be the ones who controlled the cycles of life, from birth to death, and perhaps even beyond. At this point, you may find yourself wondering, how did people really know all of this? Was it merely legend, passed down through stories, told over campfires, and in quiet temples? Well, many of these beliefs were preserved in the great historical and mythical texts of the time, such as the Shanhai Jing. This ancient text became more than just a book of creatures and mountains. It was a map of the spiritual world. It charted the landscapes of both the physical and the divine, blending what people saw with what they believed. In this way, the mountains were a living presence. They weren't just places. They were forces of nature and spirit, both feared and revered. But while we can read these stories today, there's something deeply profound in how they shaped the mindset of ancient Chinese people. They didn't just believe in these forces, they experienced them. To climb the mountain was to embark on a journey into the unknown, but also into a deeper understanding of the self. The rituals, the offerings, the prayers, they weren't just for the gods. They were ways of inviting change into one's life. The mountain became a mirror, reflecting back both your courage and your vulnerabilities. This deep connection to nature, the divine, and the unknown was what made the mountains so powerful in the imagination of the ancient Chinese. And so, as we sit here tonight, imagining these ancient worlds, it's easy to get lost in the mysticism of it all. The mountains, with their towering peaks and veils of mist, have long stood as symbols of the unknown, both terrifying and awe-inspiring. But perhaps more than anything else, the mountains in these ancient myths serve as a reminder of the deep mysteries that remain, not just in the natural world, but within each of us. Take a moment now, as you rest, to think of those ancient mountains, the wind moving gently through the trees, the sacred silence that envelops you as you stand at the base, looking up at the peaks. The stories of gods, immortals, and beasts that once roamed these heights are a testament to the power of nature to inspire awe and wonder. The mysteries may never be fully uncovered, but that's what makes them so captivating, isn't it? In a way, we still journey to those heights in our own minds, seeking meaning, seeking connection, seeking the unknown. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, allow the peaceful sounds of the mountains, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of unseen creatures to lull you into a deep, restful sleep. Let the mystery remain, just as it is untold, but comforting in its quiet presence. As the mountains stand, silent and eternal, let them remind you that sometimes the most profound peace comes from embracing the unknown. As the world grows quieter and the soft whispers of the night continue, let's drift a little deeper into the mysteries of the mountains. We've learned about the towering peaks, the divine creatures, and the fearsome beasts that the ancient Chinese believed roamed these places. But there's more to these mountains than just osin and monsters. The mountains were also integral to the everyday lives of those who lived in their shadow, shaping both their practical existence and their spiritual practices. The mountains were a place of refuge, but also of pilgrimage. For centuries, people journeyed to these high places, hoping to receive wisdom, blessings, or even just a glimpse of the divine. The ancient Chinese believed that by ascending the mountains, they could enter a sacred space where the barriers between the mortal world and the gods were thinnest. Imagine yourself making that journey. Each step takes you higher, and with every new elevation, you leave behind a little of the world you knew, entering into a space that is both physical and spiritual. But why was this so important? It's because mountains were seen as the very foundation of the world. In the mythological worldview, the mountains were more than just beautiful landscapes. They were the anchors of the universe, supporting the heavens above. The ancient Chinese believed that if they could reach the top of a mountain, they could touch the heavens themselves. In their minds, the higher you climbed, the closer you were to the gods. This wasn't just an abstract belief. It was an active part of their daily lives. People journeyed to these mountains to pray for good harvests, to seek divine guidance, and to feel the transformative power that these sacred places held. This connection between humans and the divine was also symbolized in the stories that came from these mountains. For example, one of the most famous figures in Chinese mythology, the Queen Mother of the West, resided in the Kunlun Mountain. She wasn't just a queen. She was an embodiment of the mysterious power of the mountains. The Queen Mother of the West was said to hold the key to immortality, and her peaches, which were said to grant eternal life, were coveted by gods and mortals alike. Her presence on the mountains symbolized the connection between mortality and divinity, a reminder that these towering peaks were the boundary between life and the afterlife. At the same time, there was an undeniable tension. These mountains, so sacred and powerful, were also dangerous. To ascend the mountains wasn't a simple journey. It was a test. The higher you went, the more you encountered spirits and beings that might challenge you, test your courage, and question your worth. It wasn't just about climbing to the top. It was about what you learned along the way. Think about the legends of these mountain journeys. The stories often describe not just the physical act of climbing, but the spiritual transformation that occurred during the ascent. To the ancient Chinese, climbing a mountain was akin to a personal pilgrimage, where the physical effort of the climb mirrored the emotional and spiritual trials that one faced in life. Some stories tell of people who, after climbing to the top, were forever changed. Sometimes they would return with knowledge or wisdom granted by the gods, and sometimes they would disappear never to be seen again, lost to the mountains forever. Historians still argue whether these stories were meant to be taken literally or if they were simply metaphors for the personal struggles of life. Were these tales of divine transformation based on actual pilgrimages, or were they reflections of the internal journeys people made as they faced the challenges of life? It's difficult to say. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. What is clear, though, is that the mountains represented both an escape and an obstacle, a place where the unknown could be explored and where transformation could take place. As you continue to settle into the night, imagine what it would have been like to undertake such a journey. The climb would be long, the air growing thinner as you ascended, and the view below shrinking further away. The peaks of the mountains would be shrouded in mist, and the further you went, the more you might feel the presence of something otherworldly just beyond your reach. The ancient Chinese believed that as you climbed higher, the veil between you and the gods became thinner. What would you ask them if you could? Would you seek immortality as the gods did? Or would you simply ask for wisdom, a glimpse into the mysteries of the universe? And as you rest now, think of these ancient journeys, the pilgrims who climbed, the gods who watched, and the spirits who might have tested their courage, perhaps in some small way. These ancient myths and stories are meant to remind us that the journey of life itself is just like climbing a mountain. It's not about how far you go or how high you climb. It's about what you learn along the way and the moments of stillness and reflection you find on your journey. The mountains were more than just the backdrop to these ancient stories. They were the stage on which the most profound transformations could take place. Just like these pilgrims, you too may find that your own path is shaped by the steps you take and the quiet moments in between. And so, as the stories of gods and immortals settle around you like a soft blanket, feel the peace that comes from knowing that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from reaching the summit, but from appreciating the journey itself. The night drifts onward, and as you relax deeper into your surroundings, let's take a moment to pause at the very heart of these ancient Chinese beliefs. What we've learned so far is fascinating, but there's an important piece we haven't fully explored yet. How all of these beliefs about the mountains and the creatures within them shaped the everyday lives of the ancient Chinese. Mountains were not just mythical. They were practical, and they were a part of everything. How people farmed, how they organized their societies, and even how they planned their cities. Mountains were often seen as natural defenses, protecting communities from invaders and the unpredictable forces of nature. Think about how a fortress would function, providing protection from the outside world. Now, imagine that mountain as the fortress of the universe itself, providing shelter and safety from both the physical and spiritual dangers of the world. The ancient Chinese didn't just perceive mountains as looming presences of awe and fear. They believed that their positioning The way they rose above the land was part of the cosmic design. They shaped their settlements accordingly, building cities and towns at the foot of mountains, not only for practical reasons, but also for spiritual protection. In some cases, these mountains were treated as literal guardians. For example, Mount Heng, one of the 5 sacred mountains, was thought to have protective powers, shielding the surrounding areas from both earthly and supernatural threats. People built temples and shrines dedicated to the gods of these mountains, offering incense and sacrifices to maintain a harmonious relationship with the land and its divine inhabitants. These acts weren't just about showing respect to the mountains. They were believed to influence the quality of life itself. You see, the ancient Chinese lived in a world where the lines between the spiritual and physical were often indistinguishable. The gods who lived in the mountains weren't abstract concepts. They were active participants in everyday life. Farmers would pray to mountain deities for good harvests, while soldiers might seek blessings from mountain gods before heading into battle. The belief in the divine power of these places was so strong that it influenced everything, from architecture to daily rituals. And it wasn't just the gods that were thought to reside in the mountains. As we've mentioned, terrifying creatures also played a key role in how ancient people viewed these places. However, some creatures were believed to be protectors, keeping evil at bay. For instance, in the case of the Bai Zi Ge, which we've previously discussed, it wasn't just a fearsome beast, but also a guide. Legends say that the Bai Zi helped the Yellow Emperor, one of China's most revered mythical figures, defeat otherworldly monsters. By seeking the wisdom of such creatures, ancient Chinese people hoped to gain protection and strength. It was a deeply reciprocal relationship. The mountains offered protection, but it was up to the people to maintain the balance. With respect, reverence, and proper rituals, think about this now. Imagine yourself living in an ancient village, nestled against a sacred mountain. The towering peak seems to touch the sky itself, and every day you look up to see the gods watching over you. Maybe you've offered incense or left a small gift at the foot of the mountain, hoping for a blessing. The mountains, even in their isolation, provided a constant connection to the divine world. You can almost feel the peace that comes with this belief that there's something larger than yourself watching over you, guiding your steps and protecting you from unseen dangers. But the mountains didn't just offer spiritual protection. They offered physical shelter too. Ancient Chinese architecture took inspiration from these sacred peaks. The feng shui principles, for instance, were rooted in the belief that the mountains shaped the flow of energy, or qi, in the land. Just like the mountains protected the land from evil spirits, the positioning of homes and buildings was thought to bring prosperity and good health. Settlements would often be built with the mountain behind them, as if to symbolize divine protection, with the mountains acting as guardians of the people. Historians often argue whether these beliefs were based purely on superstition or if they reflected a deeper understanding of the world and nature. Were the ancient Chinese merely trying to explain their lives through mythology, or did they have a sophisticated understanding of the ways in which the natural world affected their well-being? Some believe these practices were deeply connected to an early form of environmental awareness, an understanding that the placement of your home and the way you interacted with nature could impact your survival. By respecting the mountains, you were respecting the natural world, and in return, you were given protection. So now, as you rest, imagine the comfort that ancient people must have felt, knowing that the mountains held the power to protect them, whether through the gods, the creatures, or the very earth beneath them. The mountains provided not just shelter, but a connection to a greater mystical world. The towering peaks weren't just symbols of danger. They were the keepers of peace, the quiet guardians of the land. You could almost hear the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees, the soft murmur of ancient prayers carried on the breeze. As you drift further into your sleep, allow these thoughts to settle into your mind. Just as the ancient Chinese saw the mountains as a way to understand and navigate their world, so too can we look to the mysteries of the natural world for our own peace and comfort. The mountains may stand silent, but they are always watching, always listening, and always guiding us if we choose to listen. The night continues to unfold gently around you, and as the moments pass, we delve deeper into the mysticism of these ancient beliefs. We've learned a lot about the gods, the creatures, and the sacred mountains of ancient China, but there's still more to uncover. These mountains, revered and feared, played a central role not only in mythology, but in the very way ancient Chinese people understood their world and connected with it. While mountains were seen as the abode of gods, divine beings, and terrifying monsters, they also served as a reminder of the cyclical nature of life. The mountains, in their unyielding presence, seemed to symbolize both the eternal and the transient, offering a sense of comfort through their permanence, while simultaneously serving as a warning of the dangers that lurked in the unknown. The mountains were the one constant in a world that was constantly shifting, both physically and spiritually. Their stillness offered peace, yet the legends tied to them were a reminder that even peace had its price. Consider the myth of the Mount Hua, one of China's 5 sacred mountains, which was not only a site for pilgrimage, but also for introspection. It was said that those who climbed to the summit could transcend their mortal limitations and reach a higher understanding of the universe. This idea of transcendence was deeply embedded in Chinese thought. The belief that by connecting with nature, you could connect with the divine. But like most great journeys, this pilgrimage was not an easy one. The mountain was notoriously treacherous, with narrow paths and steep cliffs that tested the resolve of all who ventured to the top. It was a journey that forced the climbers to confront not just the physical difficulties, but also their own inner fears and limitations. The Pusu, Mount Hua, myth represents something more than just a mountain. It represents the philosophical idea of facing the unknown, of pushing through difficulty and coming out transformed. It mirrors the path that many ancient Chinese believed was necessary to achieve enlightenment or even immortality. The higher you went, the closer you got to the divine, but the harder it became to maintain your balance. Much like life itself, it was a struggle between the material and the spiritual, the physical and the metaphysical. The mountain was both a challenge and a teacher, and the pilgrims who climbed it did so in the hopes of discovering something deeper about themselves. It's fascinating to think that these ancient beliefs, these myths, were so closely tied to the physical world. The ancient Chinese didn't just tell stories about gods and monsters living in mountains. They lived these stories. These beliefs were the backdrop to daily life. The mountains were not some far-off concept. They were immediate, real places that shaped the culture, the rituals, and the way people saw their place in the universe. The mountains were always present, watching, listening, protecting, and sometimes testing. There's something calming in that idea, isn't there? To think that for all the fear that surrounded these mountains, they were also seen as places of great personal transformation and connection to the divine. The ancient Chinese didn't simply fear the creatures of the mountains. They respected them. They understood that the creatures, the gods, and the mountains themselves were part of a grand, interconnected tapestry. The mountains, with their towering heights and mysterious landscapes, were simply the stage on which the drama of life played out. As you settle deeper into relaxation, imagine the climbers of ancient China trekking up these perilous mountains. Every step brings them closer to the summit, to the divine. But with each step, they also face greater danger. The mountain path narrows, the air thins, and the wind picks up. They push forward, not knowing exactly what awaits them at the top. Perhaps wisdom, perhaps a test, perhaps even the ultimate gift of immortality. But for now, all they can do is keep climbing, keep moving forward, trusting in the mountain and what it represents. Historians still debate the true meaning of these mountains and the spiritual journeys associated with them. Were they merely symbolic, or did they represent a deeper understanding of the human condition? Some scholars believe that these mountains were meant to teach the ancient Chinese people about balance. The balance between fear and respect, between danger and growth. Others argue that these mountains were simply seen as sacred, magical places that inspired reverence without needing deeper explanation. Either way, these beliefs shaped the lives of countless people, and they continue to influence the culture and spirit of modern China today. The mountains remain silent and eternal, bearing witness to the stories of gods, creatures, and pilgrims alike. And as you rest here tonight, you can almost feel the ancient presence of those mountains, standing tall and unchanging, their stories still alive in the quiet corners of the world. As you breathe in the peace of the night, let these ancient ideas wash over you. The mountains may have been places of danger, but they were also places of possibility. Places where the sacred and the mundane met, where people could find meaning in the most difficult of journeys. As you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself climbing those sacred peaks, not as a weary traveler, but as someone who is seeking, learning, and transforming. Perhaps, like the ancient pilgrims, you will find your own moments of clarity in the quiet stillness of the mountain, where the line between the world of the living and the divine is almost imperceptibly thin. The night lingers, and as the quiet continues to envelop you, we find ourselves standing on the precipice of something even more profound. We've learned about the sacredness of the mountains, their deep spiritual significance, and the creatures that haunted their heights. But let's shift our gaze for a moment to explore the cultural practices and rituals surrounding these mountains. How did these beliefs and the reverence for the mountains shape the lives of ordinary people? These sacred sites were more than just places of pilgrimage. They were places of profound influence in the shaping of Chinese culture. The ancient Chinese didn't just go to the mountains to offer sacrifices and seek the gods' blessings. They built their entire spiritual lives around these mountains. The feng shui traditions, which we've touched on before, were deeply rooted in this connection. You see, the ancient Chinese believed that the positioning of mountains, both on the land and within the context of human settlements, could significantly affect the flow of energy, or qi. The direction and placement of mountains were thought to influence everything, from the health of the people to the prosperity of the land. The sacred mountains weren't just spiritual landmarks. They were the key to maintaining harmony with the world. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how pervasive this belief in the power of mountains was. Imagine, for example, a family living in a small village nestled at the foot of a mountain. The village wasn't just placed randomly. It was carefully positioned to ensure the mountains stood as protectors, guiding the flow of qi. Even homes and temples were constructed with this in mind. Ancient Chinese architects believed that a building's alignment with the surrounding mountains determined the luck, fortune, and harmony that would exist within its walls. This wasn't just superstition. It was a way of life, a practical application of sacred beliefs. But it wasn't just about positioning. People also practiced specific rituals when they went to the mountains to ensure that they maintained a good relationship with the divine beings residing there. The Shan Hai Jing records numerous rituals and offerings that were meant to appease the gods of the mountains. These rituals often involved burning incense, making offerings of food or valuable items, and performing dances or chants to invoke the god's protection. Imagine a quiet mountain temple, the air filled with the scent of incense and the soft sound of prayers being whispered in reverence. Some of these rituals were carried out by professional priests or shamans, while others were done by ordinary people seeking divine intervention for everyday concerns. The connection to the mountains was deeply personal. It wasn't just about seeking immortality or spiritual power. It was about daily life. People turned to the mountains for guidance in everything from agriculture to health, believing that by honoring the mountains, they could align themselves with the natural rhythms of the earth. As we sit with this, let's pause for a moment and consider how different life must have been. Imagine that you lived in a world where the mountains were always watching, always listening, and you had to take great care to maintain your relationship with them. There were constant reminders, whether it was the whisper of the wind through the trees or the distant peaks that called out to you, guiding your every step. The mountains weren't distant entities, but active participants in the shaping of your world. Every decision you made, every ritual you performed, was a way of staying in harmony with the divine forces that governed the land. And yet, as deeply as the mountains shaped daily life, there was also an understanding that their power could be as dangerous as it was benevolent. If the mountains could offer blessings, they could just as easily take them away. There are many stories of people who sought too much from the mountains, asking for more than they were given, and who found themselves punished by the gods for their arrogance. The mountain gods, in their wisdom, would not tolerate greed or disrespect, and the ancient Chinese believed that the mountain's power had to be approached with humility and reverence. Historians have long discussed whether this balance, this push and pull between respect and fear, was the true foundation of ancient Chinese spirituality. Was it fear that kept people humble, or was it reverence for the natural order and the gods that lived within it? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. After all, the ancient Chinese were keenly aware of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of nature. The mountains, with their power to both give and take, were a constant reminder of that delicate balance. Now, as you sink further into the quiet of the night, let the gentle mystery of these ancient practices wash over you. Imagine the simple yet profound beauty of these rituals. People offering their prayers, their hopes, and their gratitude to the mountains with a sense of respect and reverence that has long been lost in our modern world. There is something peaceful in the idea that by simply aligning yourself with nature, by recognizing the divine in the earth itself, you could find peace. The mountains, silent and unmoving, stood as witnesses to those rituals, holding their wisdom in the stillness. And as you rest now, with the sound of the mountain's eternal presence in your mind, consider the sense of serenity that would have come with this way of life. The mountains, as guardians and guides, would always be there, offering their power, their wisdom, and their protection. Their silent, watchful presence would continue, even as time passed, as a constant reminder that we, too, are part of this mysterious world. Let this thought guide you into a deeper calmer sleep. As the mountains stand ever watchful, holding their secrets close, just as they've done for centuries. Maybe in the stillness of the night, you can hear the faintest whisper of their ancient wisdom, gently lulling you into rest. The night is now fully settled, and the peace of the mountain landscapes surrounds you. As you sink deeper into relaxation, let's continue our journey into the deeper realms of ancient Chinese beliefs. We've already explored how mountains were seen as the dwelling places of gods, protectors, and mythical creatures. But what about the larger, more abstract role the mountains played in the ancient Chinese worldview? In their minds, the mountains were not just places for gods and mythical beings to reside. They were the physical manifestation of the natural forces that governed the world itself. Consider this for a moment. Ancient Chinese philosophy, especially in the Taoist tradition, viewed the world as a place in constant flux, where everything, every being, every element was interconnected. Mountains, with their immovable presence, represented stability, endurance, and the cyclical nature of life. In Taoism, the concept of yin and yang, the balance between opposites, was seen everywhere in the natural world. Mountains, with their towering heights and immense strength, symbolized the yang, or the masculine, active, and powerful energy, while the valleys and rivers that wound through the mountains represented the yin, the passive, receptive, and nurturing energy. The ancient Chinese believed that harmony between these forces, yin and yang, was essential to the health and prosperity of both individuals and society. The mountains, in this sense, were not just sacred places they were living, breathing embodiments of cosmic balance. To be in the presence of the mountains, to make pilgrimages to their peaks, was to align oneself with the natural flow of the universe, to become one with the harmony of yin and yang. Historians have long debated the role of these philosophical ideas in shaping not only religious practices, but also societal structures. Was it just the symbolism of the mountains that influenced daily life, or did it also shape how people interacted with the land around them? Many believe that these ancient practices were integral to the ways in which communities structured their society, whether it was the placement of cities or the daily rituals that governed how people lived in balance with the earth. The ancient Chinese didn't see themselves as separate from nature. They saw themselves as part of it, and the mountains were both the backdrop and the guide for this profound connection. But as much as the mountains were seen as a symbol of stability, they were also a reminder of the ever-present power of change. The great peaks that towered above the land were not static. They were shaped by time, weather, and the forces of nature. They were both eternal and transient, a paradox that captured the essence of life itself. This was especially important in the understanding of human existence. The ancient Chinese believed that just as the mountains had endured through the ages, so too could human beings endure the trials and challenges of life. Life, in all its forms, was in constant flux, but it was also about finding balance amidst that change. This belief was reflected in the countless myths and stories that arose from the mountains. The legendary creatures that inhabited the peaks weren't just frightening monsters. They were representations of the natural forces that could either nurture or destroy. Some creatures were believed to represent the harshness of nature, like the terrifying giant bird, whose wings could block out the sun. This bird was a force of yang, powerful, dominant, and destructive. But there were other creatures that embodied more gentle forces, like the baize, a lion-like creature who shared wisdom with the emperor, symbolizing protection and knowledge. It's easy to see how the ancient Chinese Sayat, living in a world where nature was both awe-inspiring and unpredictable, would turn to these mythical beings for guidance and understanding. The creatures that lived in the mountains were reflections of the forces of nature itself, and while they were believed to be dangerous, they were also part of the necessary balance of life. They were both feared and respected symbols of the power of nature that could neither be controlled nor ignored. Now, as you rest, imagine what it must have felt like to live in this ancient world where mountains were seen as both a source of power and a mirror of the world's deepest truths. The mountains were more than just places to visit. They were places to understand. By journeying to the peaks, you were aligning yourself with the flow of the universe, the balance between yin and yang. Every step you took in these sacred places was a step toward understanding your place in the grand scheme of life. The mountains also provided a sense of comfort and stability. Just as they had endured for centuries, so too could human beings find endurance through their connection to the divine forces within these sacred spaces. The ancient Chinese people didn't just live in the mountains. They lived with them, and in doing so, they found meaning, purpose, and a deeper connection to the world around them. The mountains, in their stillness and power, offered a constant reminder that no matter how much the world might change, the natural order of the universe would always remain. As you drift further into sleep, imagine standing once again at the base of a mountain, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath you. The mountains are silent now, their peaks lost in mist, but they stand steady and unmoving, eternal, in their watch over the world. The same stories, the same forces, the same balance that shaped the ancient world still shape our world today, even if we no longer see them in the same way. Let the wisdom of these mountains wash over you, their ancient power and quiet presence filling you with a sense of peace in the stillness of the night. As you rest, remember that the mountains will always be there, silent, patient, and eternal. They remind us that life is a balance of change and stability, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the stillness. The quiet night wraps itself more deeply around you, and as you relax further, let's turn our attention once more to the profound symbolism of mountains in ancient Chinese culture. While the gods and creatures that lived in these sacred places certainly made them awe-inspiring, there was also a deeper understanding of how these towering peaks shaped the way people thought about life, death, and the cycles of existence. In Chinese philosophy, particularly Taoism, the natural world is seen as a reflection of a greater cosmic order. The mountains, with their unchanging strength and their connection to both the heavens and the earth, symbolized the harmony between life and death, growth and decay. Mountains were seen as the spine of the earth, a representation of endurance and strength. They were also a reminder that all things must eventually return to the earth. The ancient Chinese believed that the mountains, in their enduring stillness, contained the wisdom of ages past. Mountains were often viewed as a source of deep, unfathomable knowledge, one that could only be accessed by those who were willing to undergo personal trials. These trials were not only physical, but also spiritual. To ascend the sacred mountains was to engage in a process of transformation. The journey wasn't just about reaching the peak. It was about becoming something more than you were before. As the Taoists might say, it was about returning to your true, natural self, aligning with the flow of the universe. But this belief didn't only exist in the lofty realms of the elite or the divine. It was also a part of the everyday lives of the people. For the farmers, the craftsmen, and the common people, the mountains represented a form of natural stability and balance. They didn't just look up at the mountains in awe. They looked to them for guidance in their own lives. The rhythm of the seasons, the way the winds would shift, and the flow of the rivers. These were all thought to be guided by the mountains. The ancients believed that if they followed the natural order, just as the mountains did, they would find peace and prosperity. It was not uncommon for people to travel to the mountains for wisdom, whether it was seeking advice from spiritual masters or learning from the natural environment itself. For many, the journey to the mountain was a rite of passage, an opportunity to reflect on their own lives and realign themselves with the natural world. And even for those who never made the pilgrimage to the peaks, the mountains remained a powerful force in their daily lives. People would build their homes in a way that respected the mountains, adhering to the principles of feng shui to ensure that their energy would align with the natural order. The belief that the mountains governed the balance of the world infused nearly every aspect of life. But there was also a darker side to the mountains. Their fierce, untamable nature. Mountains, while often seen as symbols of endurance and protection, could also be treacherous. The ancient Chinese were well aware of the dangers that lurked in the mountains. Landslides, floods, and sudden storms were a constant reminder that the power of nature, though revered, could also be destructive. The creatures that lived in the mountains, the fierce Bai Zi and others, were both protectors and destroyers. They represented the dual nature of the world itself. the balance between creation and destruction. Historians still argue whether these tales of dangerous creatures and treacherous mountain landscapes were simply cautionary tales, or if they were meant to convey a deeper message. Some believe that these stories were warnings for people to respect the forces of nature, while others argue that they were simply a reflection of human fears of the unknown. Either way, they served to reinforce the idea that the mountains were powerful, unpredictable forces. They couldn't be controlled, and they couldn't be tamed, but they had to be respected. And it wasn't just the physical dangers of the mountains that the ancients feared. The mountains were also seen as a place where the boundary between life and death was thinner. Legends abound of heroes or seekers who ventured into the mountains in search of immortality, or of those who journeyed to the mountains only to disappear, never to be seen again. The mountains were where the realms of the living and the dead seemed to meet, where the journey of life could suddenly transition into the unknown realm of the afterlife. Perhaps this idea of life and death coexisting within the mountains is what gives them their enduring sense of mystery. Even today, people still visit the great peaks, not just for their beauty, but for their spiritual significance. And as you rest, imagine yourself standing at the base of one of these peaks, looking up at the towering mountains that have witnessed centuries of human history. They stand still, timeless and unmovable, and yet full of life. Life that is shaped by every gust of wind, every passing storm, and every living creature that walks upon them as you drift toward sleep. Think of these sacred mountains, silent, eternal, and full of stories. Imagine the pilgrims who traveled to them, seeking wisdom, transformation, and perhaps even a glimpse of immortality. Their journey wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about finding a deeper connection to the universe, to the divine, and to themselves. In their stillness, the mountains carry the wisdom of all those who came before. And now, as you rest, you, too, can feel a part of that wisdom, quiet and unspoken, resting just beneath the surface of your dreams. The night continues its peaceful progression, wrapping around you like a comforting blanket. As you sink deeper into rest, let's carry on with our journey through the ancient, mystical mountains of China. We've walked through the land of gods, monsters, and mythical creatures. We've understood how these mountains shaped the lives of the people who lived beneath their towering heights. Now, let's explore the lasting impact of these sacred mountains and their creatures on the ancient Chinese worldview, and perhaps on us as well. The mountains were more than mere geographical features or divine abodes. They were metaphors for the cycles of life itself. Every ancient Chinese belief about the mountains was in some way tied to the idea of balance and the continuous, cyclical nature of existence. As you lay back and listen, picture yourself looking out at the sprawling mountain ranges that seem to stretch endlessly across the horizon. These mountains were not just a backdrop to human life. They were the very symbol of the natural order, tall, enduring, silent, yet constantly affected by the seasons, the winds, and the elements. Mountains, in this context, were more than just spiritual places. They were representations of both the permanence and the fragility of life. Just as the mountains would stand unmoved through centuries, so too did the ancient Chinese believe in the importance of staying grounded amidst life's ever-changing forces. The cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth was mirrored in the changing of the seasons. On the mountains, the slow but sure erosion of peaks and the quiet, steady flow of rivers that wound their way around them. This cyclical nature was not just philosophical, but practical. The mountains dictated the seasons, which in turn determined the rhythm of life for the people who lived at their base. When winter snow melted, it would feed the rivers, which nourished the land below. Farmers and travelers alike understood that the mountains were essential, not just for spiritual connection, but for the flow of life itself. Life was in constant flux, but the mountains, steadfast and eternal, were the anchors, keeping everything in balance. This cyclical philosophy was not just restricted to the natural world. It extended to all aspects of ancient Chinese culture, from the governance of rulers to the relationship between humans and the gods. The emperor, as the Son of Heaven, was thought to embody the connection between the earth and the divine. Just as the mountains stood as a symbol of stability and balance, so too did the emperor's role, which was to maintain harmony between the heavens and the earth. This spiritual role was deeply intertwined with the natural world. The emperor's authority was seen as just as unmovable as the mountains themselves, and he was expected to protect the people, much as the mountains protected the land. The practice of ancestor worship also tied into this cycle. The dead were believed to return to the mountains, where they could continue to watch over their descendants. It was as if the very soil of the mountains held the spirits of those who had passed, anchoring them to the earth. In much the same way, the living were grounded in the present. People would make pilgrimages to the mountains to honor their ancestors, leaving offerings and prayers in the hopes of receiving guidance and blessings. These practices were a reflection of the belief that life and death were part of a never-ending cycle, a cycle that was made all the more sacred by the towering presence of the mountains. Even in the modern world, remnants of these ancient beliefs linger. The reverence for mountains continues in the practices of Taoism and other spiritual traditions, and mountains still hold special significance in Chinese culture. Mount Tai, one of the 5 sacred mountains, remains a site of pilgrimage, where visitors go to connect with the spiritual energy that has long been associated with the land. These mountains, both real and mythological, have stood the test of time, continuing to offer comfort, wisdom, and inspiration to those who seek them. Now, as you rest in the quiet, think about how these ancient ideas of balance and harmony apply to your own life. The mountains have always symbolized the unchanging forces of nature, but they are also a reminder of the continuous, ever-present change in the world around us. The mountains have endured through the centuries, standing as silent witnesses to the ebb and flow of human existence. Just as the ancient Chinese sought connection with the gods through the mountains, perhaps we too can find a sense of peace and stability in the unchanging aspects of life, even as everything else around us shifts. Imagine the stillness of the mountains as you drift deeper into sleep. You are standing at their base, looking up at their towering peaks, the moonlight casting long shadows over the land. The air is cool, the world around you is quiet, and you are at peace. The mountains have always been here. They will always be here, standing watch over the world in the calm of the night. Let their timeless presence remind you that, just as they have endured through centuries, so too can you find stability and peace amidst the changing tides of life. The mysteries of the mountains remain as vast and profound as ever. But in this moment, allow the stillness of their presence to settle within you. Let their ancient wisdom guide you into the quiet comfort of sleep, where all things past, present, and future find their place in the eternal cycle. The night deepens further, and with it, the serenity of the mountains lingers in the quiet spaces of your mind. As you slip into the deeper realms of relaxation, let's gently shift focus and consider how these sacred peaks, once brimming with mythical creatures and divine presence, have evolved over time. What role do the mountains play today? And how does their ancient legacy continue to shape our understanding of the world? The echoes of those ancient beliefs still resonate in the hearts and minds of many, even though the world has changed significantly since the days when goodies and monsters roamed the peaks. Today, the mountains stand not only as symbols of ancient power and spiritual significance, but also as symbols of endurance and the passage of time. They are the guardians of the earth, silent witnesses to the countless generations that have come and gone. The mountains have withstood not only the tests of nature, but also the changes in human society. And through it all, they remain steadfast, a reminder that some things, like the natural forces of the earth, are eternal. Despite the rise of modernity and technology, many people still find themselves drawn to the mountains. They are seen as places of reflection, where one can escape the noise of the world and reconnect with something deeper. In China, mountains are still considered to be powerful spiritual centers. Pilgrims still make their way to sacred sites like Mount Tai and Mount Heng, not just to pay homage to the gods of old, but to seek a deeper understanding of themselves and their place in the world. In a world that is often fast-paced and disconnected, these sacred places offer a rare moment of quiet and contemplation. What is it about these mountains that continues to draw people in, even in this modern age? Perhaps it's the quiet solitude they offer the peace that can only be found at great heights, far away from the distractions of daily life. Maybe it's the feeling of standing in the presence of something much larger than ourselves, something that transcends time and space, connecting us to a history that stretches back thousands of years. The ancient Chinese people didn't just see the mountains as part of the landscape. They saw them as living, breathing entities, places where the heavens touched the earth, where the spiritual and the physical came together. As you lie here, surrounded by the quiet of the night, let that idea settle gently into your mind. The mountains stand as witnesses to everything, every life, every story, every change. They are both timeless and ever-changing, a paradox that is reflected in the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That in a world that can feel chaotic and unpredictable, there are still places where time slows down, where the rhythm of nature still rules, and where the ancient wisdom of the earth can still be felt. The creatures that once haunted these mountains, the gods that lived among the peaks, and the monsters that roamed their slopes, all of these figures may have been metaphors or symbolic representations of the natural forces, but their enduring presence in the stories and beliefs of the ancient Chinese speaks to a deeper understanding of the world. These creatures and gods weren't just figures of mythology. They were representations of the mystery and power of nature, forces that humans could neither control nor fully understand, but that they sought to live in harmony with. Perhaps in that we can find a gentle comfort that we are, like the ancient Chinese, part of a greater whole, connected to something larger than ourselves. In a way, the mountains remind us that we, too, are subject to the same forces of nature that have shaped the world for millennia. We are born, we live, and we return to the earth. The mountains, with their quiet endurance, show us that this cycle is natural. They remind us that there is beauty in change, that even as we pass through this life, we are part of something far larger than our individual stories. In their stillness, they offer peace, and in their permanence, they offer a kind of comfort that nothing else in this world can provide. As you drift deeper into sleep, let the ancient wisdom of the mountains guide you through the quiet night. Imagine them standing tall and silent, watching over the world, bearing witness to all that has come before. Feel their presence in the cool air, the soft rustling of the trees, and the quiet hum of the earth beneath you. The mountains may be ancient, but their wisdom is ever present, timeless in its simplicity. Just as they have stood through the ages, so too do their stories live on, shaping us even now. And now, as the night quiets down completely, allow the peaceful presence of the mountains to settle over you, bringing you into a calm, restful sleep. Let the stories of gods and creatures, of ancient pilgrims and sacred journeys fade gently into the background, leaving only the peace and quiet that the mountains offer. You are safe. You are grounded. And as the mountains stand eternal, so too do you find your place in the great flow of the world.